State of Cannabis.
This is the State of Cannabis News Digest, a roundup of this week's key developments in the cannabis industry. Our top stories.
Montana has passed a House bill expanding cannabis tax revenue to support conservation on private lands, water projects, and wildlife crossings. The Texas legislature is considering two opposing cannabis bills, one to increase access for medical patients and another to shut down the hemp market. A tax hike and tribal expansion mark a dual milestone in Minnesota's cannabis rollout. Oregon's cannabis labor peace law was permanently blocked in court for infringing on First Amendment rights and violating the National Labor Relations Act.
Want to stay ahead of the smoke in America's evolving cannabis landscape? Subscribe to State of Cannabis, Weekly News Digest, your trusted source for fact-checked, nonpartisan cannabis reporting. Each week, we bring you the latest on federal reforms, state laws, industry shifts, and public health developments, all in one digestible episode. Whether you're a policymaker, patient, advocate, or entrepreneur, we've got the information you need to stay informed. Hit follow, give us a like or a thumbs up, drop a review or leave a comment. Share this episode with someone who cares about cannabis reform. Because in this industry, knowledge isn't just power, it's survival.
And now here is the deeper look at the key events in the cannabis world this week.
Minnesota's evolving cannabis market has hit two major turning points. First, lawmakers passed a budget deal raising the cannabis excise tax from 10% to 15%, even before legal sales begin in 2025. This decision, while intended to boost state revenues, has sparked concern from industry advocates who fear it could undermine the fledgling legal market and give illicit sellers an advantage due to higher consumer costs. Simultaneously, the White Earth Nation has become the first tribal government in the United States to open off-reservation cannabis dispensaries. The historic compact signed by Governor Tim Walz on May 21st authorizes up to 8 dispensaries across Minnesota. The first store opens in Moorhead this weekend, with another in St. Cloud coming soon. Under the compact, the dispensaries will be self-regulated by the tribe, but must meet state standards for safety and taxation. As state regulators prepare for a license lottery in June, many private businesses remain unable to operate, making tribal dispensaries potentially the first and only legal access points in the near term.
In Montana, cannabis tax revenue is about to play a much larger role in protecting the state's natural heritage. Governor Greg Gianforte has signed House Bill 932, which reallocates tax dollars from recreational marijuana sales to support a broader range of conservation efforts. Previously, these funds were funneled solely into the state's Habitat Montana program, which focused on public land acquisitions and easements. Now, under the new law taking effect July 1st, the money will support habitat projects on private lands, new wildlife crossings to reduce vehicle collisions, and even public water projects, broadening the conservation footprint across the state. 3/4 of the funds will still go toward Habitat Montana and water projects, 20% to wildlife habitat improvement, and 5% to the new Wildlife Crossings Fund. The change is being hailed as a win by conservation organizations across the board. Yet, the future of this funding structure may be contested. A competing bill, Senate Bill 537, also passed with bipartisan support and includes a clause stating it would take precedence if both measures are enacted. SB 537 shifts funds toward law enforcement, addiction treatment, and social services. Both bills passed with enough support to override a potential veto, setting up a legal and political tug-of-war over the direction of marijuana tax revenues in Montana. For now, HB 932 stands as a major step toward investing cannabis revenue in preserving Montana's environment and outdoor life.
In Nebraska this week, political tension has clouded the rollout of the state's new medical cannabis program. Despite voters overwhelmingly supporting legalization in 2024, efforts to pass regulatory legislation collapsed on May 21st when LB 677 failed to overcome a filibuster. The bill aimed to establish limits on use and access, but opponents claimed it legitimized recreational use and undermined ongoing legal challenges. With legislative action stalled, the responsibility now falls to the Medical Cannabis Commission. On May 22nd, lawmakers evaluated two of Governor Jim Pillen's appointees to the commission. Dr. Monica Oldenburg was advanced with support, but Laurel Muting, who previously advocated against cannabis access, was moved forward without a recommendation. Both face scrutiny from advocacy groups who fear they could slow the program's rollout or impose overly strict limitations. The stakes are high since the commission must begin accepting applications by July 1st. With no legislation in place and a regulatory body led by skeptics, Nebraska's cannabis future remains unclear. Some lawmakers have already suggested that failure to implement a patient-friendly program could lead to a push for full legalization in 2026.
In New York, cannabis regulators have taken a major step toward expanding retail access and community engagement for marijuana businesses. On May 20th, the state's Cannabis Control Board approved new regulations to relaunch and broaden the Cannabis Showcase program. Originally launched in 2023, the program allows licensed businesses to host temporary retail pop-ups, similar to farmers' markets, where cannabis products can be legally sold. The initiative had already proven successful, generating over $10 million across 60 events last year, and Governor Hochul signed legislation in March to revive and enhance it. These showcase events are designed to bring legal cannabis directly to the community, supporting both consumers and small, equity-focused businesses. With New York's cannabis market growing rapidly and nearing $1.5 billion in total sales, the showcase expansion could play a vital role in leveling the playing field for smaller players still struggling with capital access and competition from illicit sellers. While the updated rules will go through a public comment period, they mark a broader effort by the Office of Cannabis Management to push legal cannabis into more visible and accessible spaces across the state. It's part of a wider push that includes workforce training, public education campaigns, and aggressive enforcement against illegal operations, all aimed at maturing New York's cannabis market into one of the most robust and inclusive in the country.
In Oregon, a federal judge issued a landmark ruling that halts the implementation of Oregon's Measure 119, a voter-approved initiative that tied cannabis business licensing to union neutrality. The measure, which was passed last November, aimed to require all marijuana retailers and processors to enter into labor peace agreements, ensuring employers wouldn't interfere when unions reached out to workers. However, cannabis companies challenged the law, saying it suppressed their right to speak freely on union matters. The U.S. District Judge agreed, stating that the measure not only violated their First Amendment rights, but was also in conflict with the National Labor Relations Act, which is a federal law that encourages open debate in labor disputes but doesn't mandate employer neutrality. The judge permanently barred the enforcement of Measure 119, dealing a blow to Local 555 Union, which led the campaign after state lawmakers refused to act on a similar bill. This decision may have implications far beyond Oregon, as cannabis labor laws remain a contested frontier where state innovation often clashes with federal protections. Businesses welcome the reduced regulatory burden, but labor advocates fear the setback could weaken worker rights in a fast-growing but still unstable industry.
The cannabis world is changing fast, and the State of Cannabis Weekly News Digest is your anchor in the storm. Every week, we break down the top national stories in under 15 to 20 minutes, helping growers, patients, retailers, and reformers make sense of the shifting landscape. If we've helped you make better decisions, take a moment to like, follow, review, and share the podcast wherever you are consuming it with someone who needs to hear the truth. This industry is growing. Let's grow smarter together.
In Texas, a sharp clash over cannabis policy reveals the state's deep divide on how and whether to regulate THC. Lawmakers passed a sweeping ban on hemp-derived THC products, even as they considered expanding access to medical marijuana for patients with chronic pain and PTSD. At the heart of the tension is Senate Bill 3, which is now awaiting the governor's signature. It would outlaw nearly all consumable hemp products with psychoactive THC, such as Delta-8 and Delta-10. Supporters of the ban include Texas's lieutenant governor, who says it's about protecting public health, especially for youth. But the move is poised to wipe out an $8 billion industry and tens of thousands of jobs, sparking backlash from veterans, small businesses, and patient advocates. SB 3 now heads to a vote in the Texas Senate before being placed for governor's signature to become law. At that point, if you are in the possession of any THC and you are not a medical patient, you can get in trouble. At the same time, House Bill 46 is still under debate. It would expand the state's restrictive medical cannabis program. It proposes more dispensaries, broader qualifying conditions, and new delivery forms like inhalers and patches. For rural Texans and terminally ill patients, it could open long-awaited access to legal cannabis treatments. The contradiction is striking. While one hand of the state considers opening legal pathways for medical use, the other moves to criminalize over-the-counter products already in wide use. Industry groups are already preparing legal challenges, calling the ban economically reckless and medically short-sighted.
In a significant milestone for cannabis reform in Utah, the state's medical marijuana program has now surpassed 100,000 registered patients, according to the latest report from the Utah Department of Health and Human Services. That marks a 20% increase in just 1 year, and cumulative cannabis sales have nearly reached $600 million. Chronic pain remains the primary condition treated, followed by PTSD and nausea. Despite these gains, a new law, Senate Bill 64, has eliminated the ability for pharmacies to host pop-up card drives that offered affordable medical cannabis certifications. These events had been essential for many patients, particularly those struggling financially, by offering discounted cards for around $99 instead of the standard $200. Lawmakers behind the change argued that prescriptions should be issued in traditional clinical settings to prevent any perception of recreational access. At the same time, the law expanded who can recommend cannabis to patients, now including any licensed medical provider able to prescribe controlled substances. This could make it easier for patients to get approved through their primary care doctor. A March 2025 poll showed that 52% of Utah voters support adult use legalization, although political leaders remain opposed to moving beyond medical use for now.
Thanks for tuning into State of Cannabis, your weekly cannabis news digest. If you found today's episode useful, follow us, give us a like, leave a review or a comment, and share the podcast with someone who needs to hear it. We'll be back next week with more cannabis news, broken down and bias-free.